You ever wake up in the middle of doing something ordinary and the world twists a little so it feels unfamiliar? That's how it was the night I first got the message. I was at my kitchen table, my reading glasses halfway down my nose, sealing zippered little bags full of travel-size sunscreen and tiny keepsakes I'd labeled for each grandkid. I thought about Michael, my boy, about how he used to bring me dandelions and make me breakfast on paper plates when he was small. The phone buzzed, I wiped glue off my fingers and smiled, sure it would be one of those can't wait texts. Instead I read, plain as a headline, "Mom, you won't be joining us. Laura prefers it to be only her family. You've already done your part by paying." It landed like a cold hand on my back. I sat there, the kitchen light making familiar jars look strange, while that sentence replayed in my head. It wasn't immediate rage, more a slow disbelief that unspooled into a quiet ache. I thought, am I invisible? Am I the bill they expect to sign? I had been saving for this for years, small sacrifices, extra tutoring at night, skipping new shoes, sewing envelopes of 10s and 20s into a jar I called my little promise. When I logged into the travel folder later that night I saw the number. Around $22,000, my nest egg for a memory I'd wanted my family to share. But I didn't press send on a text. I didn't raise my voice. I closed the laptop and started a list instead. Not of grievances but of women I knew who'd never been offered a chance like this. Neighbors who'd given everything and never been seen. Church friends who'd sat in the background of other people's lives. As I wrote names, something inside me shifted. Maybe I'd been funding the wrong kind of love. Maybe it was time to spend this on people who actually welcomed each other. I didn't click anything that night. I didn't freeze a single card. I went to bed with the list saved and the jar under the counter. The next morning the truth hit harder. There was an itinerary and names I didn't expect to see. Wait until you hear what I saw in that email. Morning light makes things frank. I woke early, pulled on an old cardigan and poured coffee strong enough to stand a spoon in. I checked my inbox because habit makes us small chores into safety checks. Subject: final itinerary attached. Family retreat. My heart did a little hopeful skip before I opened it, foolish and tender as a child. Then I scrolled. A neat list of travelers, 8 people, their names tidy in a column. Laura, her parents, her sister, Michael, the 2 kids. No me. No Evelyn anywhere. No guest notation. The absence sat like a missing puzzle edge. I felt ridiculous zooming in and out as if the screen might blink and fix it, but it didn't. It was deliberate. I called my neighbor Rosa because she was the kind of woman who says what she sees. "They left you off?" she asked after one ring. Her voice was sharp with that protective thing the older friends have. I told her what I'd read and for a heartbeat I considered calling Michael, demanding, begging, explaining. But the truth had settled into my bones like winter coats in the closet. I could feel a line being drawn in the sand, and I didn't want to crawl back across it. Later Laura rang chipper and clipped, asking if I'd checked the final payment. Her voice was all efficient warmth. "Everything's handled here, Evelyn," she said, like she made the house rules the day she married in. I asked if they needed anything, snacks for the kids, travel pillows, and she cut me off with a sugarcoating that wasn't kind. "It might be better if you used this week to rest," she said. Rest. Or forget. That's when I opened the documents in my file drawer and read the travel fund forms again. Account owner, single signatory me. No co-owners, no joint trust. The math, the sacrifices, the nights of tutoring, everything in ink with my name under it. I considered my options. I could let this go the passive way and go along with being grateful for crumbs. Or I could take the only leverage I had, the money. That thought didn't feel like vengeance, it felt like stewardship. But I'm not reckless. I wanted to make sure I wasn't acting from hurt alone. So I did the sensible thing. Sent one last gentle message to Michael. "Anything I can bring for the kids?" It showed read. No reply. Giving him one last chance changed the course of the morning. What I did next would cork the whole plan. Don't move. You'll want to hear how the airport discovered the truth. People imagine dramatic confrontations. Raised voices, slammed doors. Mine came like a turnkey, quiet and final. I went back to the bank app, stared at the travel fund amount. Years of small cutbacks and late-night tutoring had become a number that meant memory. I hovered over the settings like a surgeon considering an incision. There was a toggle labeled something like Pause Outgoing Transactions. One click and every linked card would need my permission. I told myself I'd only use it if they left me on read. I told myself I wanted them to have one more opportunity to choose decency. I clicked. The confirmation was bureaucratic and impersonal, but it felt enormous in my hands. Freeze mode active. Manual authorization required. No fanfare, just a steady change in status. I made tea and sat in the armchair Michael used to claim as a kid when he wanted a story. Rosa popped in, smelling like laundry soap and the neighbor's jasmine, and asked if I'd called the agency. I laughed, half amazed, half weary. I did what I had to, dear, I said. And she tucked a hand into mine, quick and solid like a bandage on an old bruise. Good, she said. Maybe now they'll remember you're a person, not a purse. The calls started later, the sort that rattle you awake. At first one, then a steady pounding of missed calls and frantic texts. Michael's voice when I finally listened to the first voicemail sounded small and out of breath. Mom, the card was declined at check-in. Can you? Then the classic desperate plea. Call me, please. There was no apology, just panic. Laura texted a frantic message about rentals and, we're at the counter. I let the phone lie face down like a sealed envelope. I didn't gloat. I sat with the quiet and drank tea. I opened my little travel notebook and read an old entry. One about James, about sunburn and laughter and badly packed sandwiches on our honeymoon. The memory steadied me more than triumph ever could. This was not about proving them wrong. It was about proving to myself that quiet dignity has power. They scrambled, oh they scrambled. But what they asked afterward stunned me. Not a sincere apology, but a request. Wait till you hear the email Michael sent when they came home. They came home earlier than planned, the messages turning soft with exhaustion and calculations. The email subject line read simply, "We're back." Michael's words tried on contrition like someone slipping into a borrowed coat. He admitted things went sideways, mentioned stress, and then toned down practical, asked if I could consider returning the deposit because we had to rebook on credit. The nerve of asking for my money back while skimming past the omission felt like an old wound reopening. I sat with that message and felt how ordinary this cruelty had become. Folks often ask mothers to shoulder discomfort so everyone else can keep dancing. But I'd learned a different truth. Love without respect isn't love, it's expectation. I could have sent a sharp reply. I could have been theatrical and dramatic. Instead, I folded the laptop shut and did something I hadn't done in years. I read through my old postcards from James, the ones with his terrible doodles and a line that always said, "Keep laughing." He used to say you teach people how to treat you by what you allow. That line hummed under my skin. So I made a list. Not a list of grievances, but a ledger of possibility. Women who'd given and been overlooked, neighbors whose names never made holiday lists, church friends whose birthdays came and went without recognizing lights. For each name I sketched a small plan. Date. A room with space for everyone's stories, simple meals, and a seat at the table for people who deserve to be remembered. This wasn't a tit for tat. It was a reallocation, my money invested where it yields belonging. I called a travel agent and asked for a modest coastal cottage that felt private and safe. I booked under my name. I imagined us lighting small candles and toasting to the simple things. Afternoons of cards, nights of quiet stories, a dinner where no one had to pretend. It felt like planting seeds in a garden I wanted to visit for the rest of my life. I thought that would be the end of it. But then they asked for my money back, and what I did next surprised even me. Stay with me, this turns the whole story inside out. 2 days after the canceled plans, the refunds started pinging into my account in little parcels. Hotel reimbursements, tour returns, amounts reversed notices. It felt like small legal apologies, each one landing with bureaucratic finality. I watched the balance climb back toward that number I'd saved and thought, I could choose to feel victorious. Instead I felt cautious. Money can restore a balance sheet, but it doesn't mend the thread of belonging. That evening I sat at my kitchen table and pulled out an old notebook, the one James used to doodle on while we planned tiny adventures. I wrote down 6 names and a short sentence about each woman. Their small joys, the quiet griefs they carried, the tiny, overlooked courage they practiced daily. I called each one. The reactions were the same, surprise that anyone would think of them, then a slow dawning gratitude that made us both teary. "Why would you do that for me?" Beverly asked, voice like warm bread. "Because you matter," I said, simple as that. Planning these little escapes was different from planning for family. I measured comfort in things the others didn't. A bed that doesn't creak, a kitchen tall enough to make tea without stooping, a table wide enough so elbows don't touch. I booked a cottage near a quiet shore, told the agent to leave us alone and give us space to breathe. I mailed each woman a simple postcard explaining the plan. No fanfare, just clarity. 7 days coast, room for your stories. A subplot emerged that I hadn't expected. Rosa, my neighbor, admitted she'd been quietly angry for years when she saw me shrink to make others comfortable. You gave until you were empty, she said over coffee. Now give to yourself and the ones who'll look you in the eye. Her voice pushed me further than my own resolve sometimes did. The trip became a thing that healed more than one heart. But when they asked for the deposit back, their email laid bare their true priority. What I decided next would show them what I had learned. The message from Michael asking for the deposit again arrived like a polite hand asking for the check while skipping over the apology. I could feel the old reflex, that motherly assumption that you fix things, pulling at me. I set the email aside and went for a walk. The sky was raw and clear. Gulls calling like old-timers gossiping about the sea. In my pocket, the little notebook felt heavy with names and small plans. I rang the travel agent and confirmed the cottage. I told her to use the refunded funds for this group and to keep the booking under my name. She laughed quietly on the phone, delighted at the kind of booking she didn't get every day. You're making a difference, she said. I answered in a way that surprised even me. I'm just being myself. When Michael called later that evening, voice soft, a little ashamed, he tried to talk in circles. The kids were upset, mistakes were made, they had spent more than expected. He asked again for the deposit. I told him gently I'd see the refunds through and use them where they meant something. Silence crackled over the line like thin ice. I didn't enjoy refusing him. I didn't relish the power. I enjoyed the clarity. You either include the person whose name is on the account, or you accept the consequences of exclusion. He understood that on some level he sounded tired, older in a way that made me ache. But tired isn't the same as changed. That night I wrote in my private journal, pages I'd rarely let anyone see. I wrote about James, about the small promises, about how kindness, when unbalanced, can become entitlement. I wrote about how I taught my son to stand up for himself, and maybe now I had to teach him how to stand by others. It wasn't cruelty to keep what I had earned. It was tuition in human decency. I thought the lesson would land quietly. But when they reached the airport and the cards failed, chaos followed. Their scramble teaches us something sharp about dependence. Airport security lines move like rivers, people ebbing and flowing with anxious energy. I watched social updates roll by, pictures of straw hats, a dog-eared caption about family first. I felt a curious calm. My phone began to fill with frantic pings. Card declined, one message read. We can't check in, another said. Michael's voice in a voicemail sounded thin. The kind of voice you hear when someone realizes they've been leaning on a pillar that isn't real. Laura called me from the terminal, breathless through the receiver. We're trying everything, she said. You could hear the strain of someone outrunning a plan built on borrowed certainty. The check-in clerk typed furiously and shook her head. It's declined, she said in a voice that was part rulebook, part sympathy. The entitlement dissolved into something uglier. Fingers pointed, tempers frayed. The kids beginning to cry because grown-ups had miscounted. I didn't pick up. For a while I let the phone ring into the living room like a bell. I wandered out to the garden, felt the sun on my face. I realized, watching a small sparrow gather twigs, that sometimes the lesson of absence has more teaching power than 1,000 lectures. They had used my generosity like it was an evergreen resource. When it stopped, the reality showed who had been holding up the party by obligation and who had actually deserved the seats. By the time messages slowed to strings of apologies and requests I didn't crave to answer, the booking confirmations had begun to unspool. One by one the charges reversed, landing back in my account like little truths being returned. The practical part of me made a quiet spreadsheet so the refunds wouldn't be lost to small fees or human error. The emotional part of me made a list of things I'd never again spend on people who saw my kindness as due. They came home, deflated, embarrassed, asking for things I wouldn't hand over. The way Michael asked changed the next chapter, and what I did next surprised him. They returned with stories of overbooked excursions and upset kids. Michael's tone in the email was tired and slimmer than real regret. He asked again for some of the money. It would have been easy, so easy, to slide a check into his palm and watch the hurt dissolve into normal life. But my little seaside cottage thrummed in my mind, the windows full of light, 6 women's laughter like tide music. And I realized this was about reassigning a legacy. I invited each of the women personally. I paid for train tickets, arranged a small card for each room with a tiny note. For you. For being seen. Their reaction was better than tears. It was surprise turning into joy. A slow realization that someone else was holding space for them. Dozens of small conversations changed the trip into a chorus. Frances spoke of her first job and how staying meant she had to give up dances and moments. Beverly talked about being present for everyone except herself. In those talks we repaired a little of the world. Back home I received Michael's email asking with a new tone for his deposit back. I read it 3 times and felt an old script try to whisper. Mothers make amends so others can sleep. But I knew this script. I had been living it for decades. This time I answered with plain truth. I will keep what I had saved and spend it on people who build memory with me. Not on people who used me as a line item. He called that night voice small. We talked not like a parent and child but like 2 adults fumbling toward a needed understanding. He apologized, measured, careful. And while it wasn't the full-bellied regret I would have wanted, it was a start. He promised to learn. I accepted that he was learning on the job of life. But I did not hand him the money. I did, however, invite him to visit the photos when we came back. The trip healed more than me. It nudged others to see what they'd missed. But the final night brought a moment that made me rewrite the ending of my own story forever. The cottage hummed with small rituals. The women cooked, traded recipes, and wrote postcards to themselves in shaky but honest handwriting. We had nights of quiet conversation and mornings of slow breakfasts where nobody rushed. James' photograph sat at the head of our table, walnut frame catching the light like a familiar face. We lit a single candle each evening. Not to mourn but to remember the folks who taught us to love. One afternoon while the others napped, I took out my journal and wrote a letter. Not to Michael, not to Laura, but to the younger me. I wrote about patience, about the price of disappearing facts from your own life, and about the fierce smallness of choosing yourself. I folded the letter and tucked it into a shell I'd found on the shore, and later we walked out and let the ocean take it. All of us put something into the tide that night, words we wanted to release. Back home there was a final message from Michael, cleaner this time with fewer defenses. He said he'd been talking to Laura. That they'd started seeing patterns they didn't like. It wasn't a dramatic conversion. People don't rewrite themselves in a week, but it was a glint. He asked if he could come by soon, not for money but to talk, to listen. My answer came easy. Come when you're ready to listen. We came home different. Not because a grand gesture changed everything, but because small steady restoration had replaced the hollow rush of performance. The women carried new habits home. Phone calls scheduled with children who used to take them for granted. Photos printed and placed where they could be seen. My cottage adventure had become less of an escape than a map for living with dignity. The last message, Michael's final attempt to bargain, arrived with a twist I didn't expect. What I did next closed a door and opened a new one. When the last email arrived from Michael, it was short. Mom, can we talk? We're sorry. He added a sentence about finances, but the tone shifted from transactional to tentative. I read it on the porch while pruning roses and felt the seasons folding into each other. I invited him over for tea, and when he arrived his shoulders sagged like someone carrying too many grocery bags. He didn't ask for the money again. Instead, he brought photographs, old ones, candid and tender, of him as a boy with sticky fingers and big eyes. We sat and looked at them. He apologized for leaving me out, for letting someone else redraw our family's map. He admitted he'd been afraid to defend me, afraid of rocking the boat. I told him how frightening it is to be unseen in a house you helped fill with laughter. There was grief in both of us, but it had new edges, clear, honest, real. We talked about boundaries and the strange kindness that becomes a demand if not reciprocated. It was the kind of talk my husband and I had in small quiet moments between bills and baby baths. Michael listened. He didn't immediately change his whole life. No one does. But he promised to be more present. Not just to text apologies but to show up in small ways. That week he visited several of the women I'd taken to the shore. He brought flowers and apologetic looks and asked about recipes and stories. The acts were modest, but they were the beginning of repair. I watched him learning the hard way, by losing what he took for granted and choosing to rebuild. It reminded me how people behave when the props are removed. The real change wasn't about money. It was about being seen. But there was one last quiet triumph that sealed this story for me. One you might not expect. The women returned home with pockets full of shells and a kind of soft glow you don't get from shopping trips. They told neighbors and tucked small souvenirs into drawers. The week had given them permission to rest and to tell stories they'd never found a safe place for. For me, the gift was both simple and enormous. A table where every chair was wanted. Not long after, I received an unexpected note from Laura. She wrote carefully that she'd been wrong to push me out and that she was sorry for how she'd handled things. The letter was short and awkward but honest. Sometimes apology arrives as a small, stumbling thing, not a grand speech. I didn't throw myself into her arms, but I accepted the note as a sign she'd seen a shadow she hadn't noticed before. I also received messages from some of the women's families, the sons and daughters who realized their mothers had been carrying invisible loads. They asked how they could help, how they could do better. That ripple felt like slow, long work, better than an overnight miracle. On the anniversary of James' birthday, I set his photograph in the dining room and invited the women for a simple supper. We ate pineapple and roasted fish and laughed until our cheeks ached. We lit a candle and spoke, not of revenge but of being remembered. That night I understood fully that my choice to freeze the account wasn't vengeance. It was a pivot. From giving until I was empty to giving where the gift would be shared and cherished. The last piece fits quietly. This story ends where I begin again. But before I close, there's one question I want to leave with you. If you've sat with me through all this, here's the thing I want to leave folded into your pocket. You don't need to make yourself small so others can feel big. There's a fierce, gentle power in choosing to spend your life where you are seen. I didn't want drama. I wanted recognition. I didn't want to teach with fury. I wanted to teach with boundaries. The cottage trip taught those of us who came that being remembered is a practice. It requires attention, reciprocity, and sometimes the courage to let absence be the teacher. People ask if I regret being firm. No. I regret wasting time wondering when I should have acted sooner. I regret letting the assumption that mothers always forgive stop me from practicing clarity. But mostly I feel relief, surprising and soft, like a winter coat finally folded and put away. I have pictures of laughing faces, a notebook full of new recipes, and a small stack of letters tucked in my drawer that I might read when I'm old and want to remember how I chose myself. If this story touches a place in you, if you've been quietly giving until you felt invisible, please know this. The world will sometimes ask you to be everything for everyone. You can say yes sometimes and you can also choose carefully. Choosing yourself is not selfish. It is stewardship. It is deciding where your legacy will seed. And if you ever doubt, think of the women on that shore. Faces lit by candlelight, a photograph at the center of the table, hands clasping for no reason but gratitude. That's what I built with a jar of saved dollars and a hard-won sense of self. So tell me, if you were standing beside me that night on the shore, what would you finally let go of? What would you choose to spend your love on now that you know how precious it is? Thank you for listening. Where silence becomes strength and memory becomes power. If you like the story and find it relatable, so like the video and subscribe for more stories.